excited. I have Dr. Christopher Shaw here. He's a neuroscientist at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He holds a Ph.D. from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he is the author of over 155 peer-reviewed articles and 5 books. He has served on numerous research panels and is currently a member of the research committee of ALS Canada and a member of the scientific advisory board of Neurological Health Charities Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada. His research has focused on the causes and early stages of various neurological disorders, including ALS, Parkinson's, and autism. A key element in past and ongoing studies involves the role of environmental neurotoxins and their interactions with genetic susceptibility factors. His work has examined the potential of aluminum adjuvants to induce behavioral changes in nervous system pathologies in animal models of ALS and autism. I'm so excited. Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw, for being here today and agreeing to interview with me. So I want to dive in.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, let's dive in. I do want to talk a little bit more about you before we get right into things. So how did you get into neuroscience and research?
Well, I've always, as when I first started university, fairly soon at UC Irvine, where I did my undergraduate, I took a couple classes in neuro and I got hooked on it. And I guess I did well enough that the professor teaching the class invited me to come to his laboratory and do a project. So I did, and I was hooked, and I never went back. I changed subjects. I worked in different areas of neuroscience, but I was hooked on studying the brain and how the brain works and how the brain breaks, and those two things. And that's kind of been the focus ever since my undergraduate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I can definitely see where you'd be hooked on that.
It's pretty fascinating. Yeah, and of course, understanding it, we don't, neuroscience has been out there for a long time, but we don't really know that much about how the brain really works. And we really don't know, we don't know much about how it breaks. So for example, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's, the so-called age-related neurodegenerative diseases, we don't really know what causes them. It's not genetics per se. I mean, there are some fraction of those are genetically based. In other words, there's a gene mutation or a deletion or a gain of function or something like that. But that's a tiny fraction of the overall cases of any of those neurological diseases. I mean, there are some different ones that are purely genetic, but these are not. The big ones are not. And so really trying to figure out what it is in a world full of toxic substances is a challenge. And also, of course, keep in mind that they interact. So it's not just you have a toxin and a gene or a gene. You have usually both that are contributing. And so one thing we've been looking at recently is the so-called dark DNA that is not part of the genes. In other words, all the wiring and scaffolding that allows your genetics to work is, the analogy is like, you look at the light bulbs on, above your head and you think, let's pretend those are the genes. Okay. But behind those light bulbs are miles and miles of wiring that allows the light bulbs to go on and off. And so the dark DNA is really crucial. And it used to be called junk DNA, and it's not. It serves a real function that we don't understand. And so when you look at something like ASD, autism, you have a case where they're never finding a causal gene, but that doesn't mean there's not a genetic factor. It's just not a gene. So it's some piece of DNA that contributes in context to something else like a toxin that now gives you the disease. So, several of my colleagues have given the example. They say, well, maybe the genes or, DNA abnormalities kind of load the gun, but the toxin pulls the trigger. And we're seeing that, and maybe we're seeing that with what they're announcing, with the Kennedy announcement about a week ago. And there are various cofactors that contribute to these diseases. Otherwise, we'd all get all of them. We don't.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely something that's coming more to light and we're becoming more aware of. But I appreciate you saying how very little we actually know about the brain, because I think that's a common misperception. I think many of us think we have just such a great understanding, and it's just not where we're at yet.
Well, we know a lot. We know a lot more than our scientific ancestors 100 years ago, but no, we don't know any in depth about all of these things. For example, I was just having this conversation with a former graduate student we don't really know what human consciousness is. We just don't. Now we have some ideas, and there's, there are various hypotheses floating around, all kinds of neat experiments being done, but we still don't know. And, and again, so the neurological disease remains a mystery. And it's actually, neurology in some ways is a fairly depressing field, because there's a lot of stuff, in fact, the majority of stuff we really can't fix very well. So, for example, if you get Lou Gehrig's disease, there's not much we can do. And there's, and not much is done because, we don't know how it starts. We don't know how it progresses. We don't know what it interacts with, and we don't really know how to stabilize it. So if you could stop the progression, you might be able to do something. You're not going to replace the neurons that have died, but at least you wouldn't get worse. And we can't even do that. So that becomes a huge challenge, and that's really been a focus of a lot of what we've done. Say, can we find the early stages, ideally early enough to prevent it from going on to create the debilitating disease that is, they use the word progressive. It doesn't mean it in a good sense. It means it keeps getting worse. And one of the other things I'm studying, because I am in an ophthalmology department, is what's called age-related macular degeneration, which is the main cause of vision loss in adults over 50. And we don't really know what triggers that. And it's not purely genetic, it's not purely environmental. Something is leading to that. And the question is, if you catch it early enough, can you do something useful about it? But in many cases, neurons don't normally get replaced. Unlike, your liver cells, your little left foot cells and things like that. But, neurons don't grow back mostly. And so, you hear a lot of discussion about stem cells, but there's a huge number of problems with that. And once you've lost neurons, you've lost them. The question is, are they really gone? Or are they just resting? All those are the kind of things that are coming up in the research. There's a concept called idling neurons. And I'm starting to study hyperbaric oxygen, because one hypothesis out there is that may restore a lot of the neurons you think are dead, maybe not are dead. I mean, you remember the Princess Bride, the story, when there was dead and there's dead. Well, maybe not all of them were dead. Maybe some of them are just sitting there, not functional, idle, which looks the same as being dead, but maybe they're not really dead. And if you do certain things, maybe you could restore them, in which case you would bounce back above that threshold of loss. That's where you all of a sudden have the clinical symptoms and the downward spiral. So is that true? Don't know. That's something I'm very interested in, and that's what I'm working on, and looking at hyperbaric oxygen and Lou Gehrig's disease.
That's fascinating.
And but also aluminum toxicity. There are ways to get aluminum out of your body. And Chris Exley, Professor Exley, he's not. I guess he's not a professor anymore. You know the story about him.
Yes, well, I actually just watched the documentary, The Aluminum Age.
And it's very good. And Exley is certainly, I think, probably the most knowledgeable human being on the planet about the subject of aluminum and all of its manifestations, certainly in terms of biology. And he has some good protocols that might enable you to get aluminum out of your body. I mean, it might be time consuming, but there are some simple ways. And he has developed a way that's not involving, they have all kinds of things that will chelate all kinds of ions. The problem is they're not selective. In other words, some of the things, those things that will chelate, aluminum will also get copper and manganese, a whole bunch of things you actually need. And you don't want to do that. He's developed a way to actually do that. It's a tragedy his work was cut short, because his work was really seminal to a lot of things we're understanding about, for example, ASD and Alzheimer's, which was a lot of the focus of a lot of his work for many years. And he has some studies that suggest if you use the silicic acid, in other words, just drinking high silicic acid water. Other than making Fiji or whichever company richer, you might actually be able to.
What else? What else can you drink besides Fiji water? Because I just read this study on the silicon water. And
Exley has no connection to Fiji. He doesn't get a royalty from them. I mean, that's not the only one. And of course, plastic bottles are probably not great for a whole variety of reasons. But for a very slight bite into your pocketbook, it might get a lot of aluminum out of your body. Now, the problem as Exley has pointed out, is we live in the age of aluminum. We're surrounded by the stuff. And, we're not just getting it from one source. We're getting it from the air, from the water, from the food, especially processed food. We're getting it from vaccines. We're getting it from other medications. So, you're being bombarded. So maybe the trick is, in a toxic world, minimize your exposure to aluminum of all sorts. And, Fiji water is a way to do it. Again, I'm not promoting it. So
No, you actually jumped to one of my questions, because that to me is the big question right now. So we have enough evidence, in my opinion, to show, hey, yes, there's aluminum in the brains of
yes,
kids with autism, multiple
yeah,
sclerosis, Parkinson. How do we get it out?
yeah,
And we have, thinking of deferoxamine, that's a prescription medication that binds iron also, and then
yeah,
there's EDTA, chlorella, zeolite, and those are
all
all
those, yeah.
all different options, but there's nothing that I've found that shows great evidence comparing them
Yeah.
or showing what other, like you said, minerals are pulling out with them
Yeah.
and what you need. So I know you mentioned actually having a protocol. Where do we get that protocol?
I think he has a website, and
Right.
he does a Substack, and I think it must be on his website. He developed it with some of his students when he had a laboratory a couple years ago. And basically, again, it was just, if they were just using Fiji water, and that's the simplest protocol in the world. Drink a liter of Fiji water a day. It'll cost you a few bucks, and aluminum will come out. Because
But
the
how do we know
idea,
if it's coming out of the brain? Because we know it's getting
well,
treated, but we don't know if it's coming out of the brain, right?
well, yeah, true, good point. But he's made the idea that if you put enough of the silicates into your body, because remember, aluminum binds to silicates. That's normally how it's found. That's how it's found in nature. And so, Exley's idea is that, yes, it's not going to go directly into your brain and pull that out of your brain, but it will cause the other parts of your body that are accessible to the water, through your blood, to basically chelate the aluminum. And as it pulls out of the other areas of your body, such as bones, such as GI system and stuff, it will re-equilibrate from the brain, we hope, and it will come out of brain too. And eventually you will get rid of it. Now the problem is that in the brain, it may have already done the damages it's going to do. So it's kind of a more in some ways it's a prophylactic thing. You should be doing it a lot.
Yeah.
Again, because you live in the age of aluminum. And if you do that, you could maybe keep it from going into brain in the first place and doing the damage it does. And we know from the work of Romain Girardi and his group in Paris that, at least with the studies they've done, when it goes in, it doesn't come out easily. Now, again, the chelation studies that Exley was doing suggested that you could actually increase the cognitive scores of Alzheimer's patients by a considerable amount by just giving them Fiji water. Now, is that true? Wouldn't that be great? Now, of course, the farmer is going to hate that because, Fiji will love it, but the farmer is going to hate that because they would rather sell you pills that really don't do anything. So,
it's a business, and that's what we're fighting right now. That's what we're trying to go against. It's a big battle.
Well, yeah, and the pharma, they use aluminum adjuvants for virtually every vaccine. And this is this is like Pfizer is a key participant in this. So they sell you, or they mandate you to take these vaccines that have aluminum. You got a body burden of aluminum building up, and then of course they'll sell you useless pills that don't do anything, but they tell you that they're going to treat your Alzheimer's, which they don't really do at all. And so
many of them having also chemicals in them while they're maybe treating,
which is on top of everything else. Yeah. But from a pharma perspective, you remember I don't know if you ever read Alan Cassell's book Selling Sickness. Oh, okay. Well, it's a fascinating book. So the idea is that the big pharma companies, Merck and others, decided, it's a while back, 20 years ago, and that's Cassell's wrote his book in the early 2000s. Basically, he said the pharma decided there are too many healthy people, and therefore their market is smaller than it could be. And so the way to solve that is to either make up some diseases for which they have a product, or to allow these things to develop, because it's a win-win for them. So if they can give you the vaccines and or substances that are toxic, and then sell you the cure, well, they've just scored twice. How sweet is that? It's a little bit like the mRNA companies, Pfizer and Moderna, that they hit the ultimate sweet spot here, because They got paid to develop the product, paid a huge amount of money to develop the project, which they then sold to the same governments that paid them to develop the project, which they then could put on the market and sell for even more, and they have no product liability whatsoever. That was part of the deals. And so, they cannot be sued, at least in Canada, you can't sue them at all. And, there's no risk here.
You mean you can't sue them for any medications or just vaccines?
Well, you can't sue them for the mRNA vaccines.
Right.
Or not easily anyway. In Canada, I don't think you can at all, because these were based on emergency use authorizations, right? And so so countries sign these waivers like, we're not going to go after you if these things turn out to give you turbo cancer or myocarditis or neurological disorders and/or they're bulletproof. And they all walked away. And what's his name? Burla. What's his first name? Anthony, the head of Pfizer, the CEO of Pfizer. Anyway, he just got rewarded with, which was, again, we'll talk about that, rewarded by President Trump with a $70 billion contract. Pfizer is one of the most criminal entities.
To lower, so that was a negotiation, I believe, to lower overall drug prices of the most favored nation, drug prices for the U.S. But in that was
and in that, and they slapped him on the back, shook his hand, and said, "What a great guy you are, and thank you, Pfizer, for doing all the great stuff you do to keep humans healthy." Well, it's crap, I
don't think they can. This is my opinion. I don't think they can fully tackle that, because this is the most powerful thing in the world, pretty much running the world, and I don't think they can just shut it off, and it's going to
they can't. But this is for sure, and it will take time. But this was going in the wrong direction, in my opinion. In other words, this was rewarding the people who have, how many billions of dollars have they paid in fines over the, Pfizer, is a serial criminal. They've paid so many millions of dollars in fines for misleading both government and the public about a lot of their products. And the mRNA vaccine was one of them. And of course, the other part of the sweet spot for them was the government was actually pushing the vaccines and making mandates and and threatening people with the loss of jobs and loss of livelihoods and loss of freedom if they didn't do it. Here in Canada, I don't know if you know how bad it was up here. Okay, so we for example, we couldn't get on an airplane unless you were vaccinated.
Right. Yeah, how is that ethical at all to make you do something? Yeah.
No, it's not, because
same here in the US.
Well, we have the concept of security of the person, and it's even in our charter. It's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is supposed to be like your Bill of Rights, but it doesn't function that way at all. And so one of the key elements is called Section 7, which basically says you have the right to security of the person. Well, when you go to someone and say you have to take this product, and we don't care what you think about it, and we don't care whether you don't want it or not, it's not really your body. It's if you or our former prime minister said, well, you had a choice, but then you're going to lose your job, then you can't travel, then you can't go into a restaurant. Yeah. So and you remember the what's called Nuremberg principle. Nuremberg Code was basically consent has to be given, and it has to be free of coercion, free of penalties, or free of even rewards. So here in Vancouver, they were bribing people in the city, in the poorest part of the city. There was you get $5 in a Krispy Kreme donut, and these are poor people, but they bribed everybody. For example, I don't know if I was on suspension for 2 years for not taking the shots, and they closed my laboratory.
I did not know that.
I was unpaid suspension for 2 years. My laboratory got closed. There's a lot of drama with that because they also apparently stole money from my grants.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so they're getting a little bit of a lawsuit now on that.
Who stole money from
the university?
Wow.
So yeah. So
from the university.
Pardon me?
They stole money from the university?
No, they stole my university assigned my grant money that was in my accounts when I went on suspension. They transferred it to someone else. Yeah, it's kind of a major no-no, actually, because the correct thing was, the correct response is, oh, you either hold it for me when I come back, but I guess they thought I was never coming back. Or you basically go back to the donor and say, look, we've got X amount of your money left, because the donor, they have some say of what happens to it.
Right.
And we're not going to finish the research because Shaw's an idiot and he's on suspension because he won't do the right thing and because he's an anti-vaxxer, blah, blah, blah. And we're just going to give you whatever's back. But they didn't do that either. So,
Oh my gosh.
and we are actually going after them for what's called breach of contract, because there was a breach of contract. And it was a fair amount of money. And so, I'm left with a situation a little bit like Chris Exley. I mean, I have my job back in the sense I can teach, I can walk into my laboratory, which is full of boxes because they moved my lab, but I can't do anything. There's no money. So, it becomes this kind of endless, that's how they got Exley, basically. I mean,
Wow.
they didn't fire him per se. They just made it impossible for him to raise money for research. In other
Right.
words, he
But he
could
can't do
not.
his job. Yeah.
And he couldn't do his job. And he is, an active researcher. He had quite a big lab. He had really, really good people there. And basically said, okay, well, we're going to make it really hard for you to apply for grants. And, he'd already pissed off two major industries. One was the aluminum industry, and then secondly, the pharma. And then they basically, when people were trying to contribute to his laboratory, and they said, no, we're not letting you do that. We're not, people can send money. We're not putting it in an account for you. So you can't do any research. And he got fed up with it. And this guy is an amazing scientist. He is Mr. Aluminum, truly.
Yeah.
But when you can't do your job, so he's off doing other
Well,
stuff.
I've read a lot of Exley's studies and research and yours, and I mean, I would say you two really have led the way in aluminum research and have given us what we need today to position ourselves in fighting these vaccines because of them being in vaccines. So, it's just incredible. So thank you, to you and Dr. Exley. Like, it's just incredible what you guys have done.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. He and I have been in correspondence over the years, and I've known him for a long time. And when we watched the Kennedy Trump presentation and they're talking about Tylenol and paracetamol, things like that. Okay. Is that a cofactor? Could be. Do I think it's the main driver for ALS? No. There are a million toxic chemicals out there in the world. And the thought is, okay, well, it's given for pain relief, especially after vaccination, and it blocks glutathione or it diminishes glutathione. No, sure, maybe. But that's not driving the boat. What's driving the boat, what they didn't really talk about, except to say, oh, it's bad, was the elephant in the room, which is the aluminum that comes at us from every direction. And for children, it's mostly through the vaccine. Okay. Vaccines, multiple.
He did mention in there removing mercury and aluminum from vaccines.
Well,
so I was hopeful for that.
I was hopeful too, but that's apparently not going to happen. Or not soon, because that's what needs to happen. And okay, and mercury, by the way, is out except for the flu vaccine. Okay, but getting aluminum out, there was I'll tell you a story about that came from France. Romain Girardi, who is one of the main aluminum researchers in France. He's now retired, but his lab continues. They basically had convinced a science panel in the French Senate to understand that aluminum was a part of the problem they were investigating, for various neurological disorders. They were looking at something called macrophagic myofasciitis, which was in adults, by the way. And they had done a lot of studies. They learned where aluminum goes when it gets injected, all kinds of good stuff. So this committee was going to suggest banning aluminum in vaccines in France. Good idea. And that campaign went on for a while. And then Novartis, which is the main pharma in France, said, okay, if you do that, we're leaving France. And there's 20,000 jobs that are going to disappear in Marseille. So that idea got canned. And the same thing, the pharma will do that here in the United States and Canada as well. And so you also have to think about what they're going to suggest instead. They're going to suggest, oh, well, we'll use another adjuvant. Sure, you could do that. But are they safe? Have they been tested? And probably not, and probably won't be, because the testing by the pharma is crap. It's so bad it's not even crap. It's a joke.
Like non-existent.
It's essentially non-existent. I remember a study by a company in New Zealand. They're having a meningitis concern, and they had to do a pre-clinical study. So they did animals, and they had to have 5 animals minimum to do the trial. but they didn't have to, according to NIH guidelines, they didn't have to be the same animal or type. So I think I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think they had 3 gerbils, a rat, and a mouse. I'm like, that's something ridiculous.
Yeah.
And they weren't the same sex. So I think, all right, seriously. I mean, like that's supposed to be your clinical trial. And the evaluation is they did these trials and they looked at the mice and said, well, they look, or rats, mice, gerbils, whatever they were, and they said, oh, they look okay. Did they do any histology? No. Did they any toxicology? No. Did they do any biochemistry? No. Just mice look fine. And that was it. That was their preclinical trial safety data. And so the danger is the pharma. Remember, one of the things the pharma was saying when, or Moderna and Pfizer were saying, mRNA doesn't need an adjuvant, right? Well, let's just make everything an mRNA vaccine. You got to watch out for that because they will do that. And guarantee they'll do that.
Yeah, and well, that's why if the aluminum does get removed, I'm thinking, what are they going to put in place of it?
Because, well, that's it. So, and the problem you're always going to have is because the traditional vaccine formulations are only part of the pathogen, you're basically always going to get what's called secondary vaccine failure. In other words, after a fairly short period of time, they don't work anymore. So now what? Boosters, endless boosters, or another adjuvant that may or may not be safe, probably not, and or an mRNA vaccine, which of course we know is not safe. It's not just the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. We don't know what's going to happen if you start throwing this into everything. And of course, that's what a lot of governments would like to do. Canada has just built a giant facility at my university to basically promote mRNA for everything.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It's one of those.
You did a lot of research on COVID-19 on the mRNA vaccine. Yes. And so what were kind of like your biggest takeaways from those?
We wrote 2 books that were connected to that. We didn't actually do the bench science because we couldn't. But we did evaluate the phase trials, and we did evaluate the kind of the consequences of those, and they were pretty horrific. And it is indeed making people sick. And the more you take, and this is the work from the Cleveland Clinic in the United States, the more you take, the more sick you get. And the more hospitalizations you're going to get. So there's a direct relationship of how many shots you take and how likely you're going to get COVID again, you're going to be hospitalized, et cetera. And it was, remember, the idea was no, 1 and you're done, or 2 and you're done, and you're not going to get it, you're not going to transmit it. And we know that's not true. It's completely not true. And it never was. So, we're and now facing the idea that mRNA is going to be used for everything is a bit scary. So, it's selected applications, they were talking, well, we can make new heart muscle to replace if you had a heart attack. The problem is these products go everywhere. And we know the biodistribution of these things is all throughout your body, everywhere. With the idea, remember back when they first came out, we have to store them at -80 because they're so fragile. And right. At my university, they were going around and asking everybody who had a ultra freezer, can we borrow your freezer to store the mRNA vaccine? And of course, it was all hogwash because these things are ridiculously resistant to degradation, and they travel. The biodistribution is terrifying. They go everywhere. They go into breast milk. They go into the fetus. They go in. They go all over your body. They were supposed to stay in your deltoid muscle. They don't. They're everywhere, and including brain. And they knew that. There was an offshoot of Moderna called Valera, which was a subsidiary company, and they did some animal studies, 2017, I think, so long before COVID. And they basically said, well, when we look for the mRNA, and presumably therefore the spike protein, we're kind of seeing it everywhere. Yeah, there's more in your lymph nodes than in your brain, but there's still some in your brain, which right away, it's got to be a huge red flag. Why is it in your brain? Because we know what happens when a foreign thing gets into your brain. Your immune system in your brain destroys it. But guess what? It destroys the cells that it's attached to. So it comes back to what I said earlier. Brain cells don't reproduce very easily, or aren't replaced very easily. So now you start breaking brain cells. What do you think is going to happen? We know perfectly well what's going to happen when you put that in place of the immune response. It's going to attack those cells, and it does. So, and when they said, oh, it's going to stay in your muscle, it does not. It completely does not. That was complete hogwash. Anyway.
Oh my God.
So taking aluminum out of vaccines has to happen. on the other
Okay.
hand,
And with the
what are
aluminum,
what
can
are these
you
bad boys going to do? Yeah.
can you talk about, because I think a lot of us want to know how the aluminum in the vaccine adjuvants dissociates, like how it gets to the other areas of the body and the brain. Is it dissociating into, from that salt formulation, or how does
Yeah.
like the amorphous piece
Yeah.
or the antigen affect it?
Okay, it's a good question, and some of that is not known. But it's basically it's dissociating from the carrier, whether it's the hydroxide or the potassium sulfate, and it's the ions that are binding to other things. And aluminum has the characteristic that it binds very, very well to most of the molecules that your body does need: carbon, phosphorus, uh, and it binds to proteins, it binds to DNA, it binds to basically everything. And aluminum, as Exley has pointed out, was selected out of evolution. It just simply, we did not evolve as a species or anything on Earth, frankly, didn't, didn't ever use aluminum. There are very rare exceptions to that, but it's, there are not many. And I can only think of one in plants. But basically, life on Earth doesn't use aluminum for anything. And therefore, all it can do is havoc. It gets in there and it gloms up the machinery and creates creates a whole bunch of things. But one of them, it can also generate free radicals. It can also do, interfere with normal biochemistry and normal cellular function. And, at every level of the nervous system, going right down to gene function, all the way up through cognition, it messes with everything. And this is a problem that is I mean, you can ignore it as much as you want, and we have been. We meaning collectively, but the consequences are that we're seeing we see a rise in all the neurological diseases. We see a rise in a whole bunch of other disorders that if Exley is right, and I suspect he is, because he's probably the most knowledgeable person about aluminum. I suspect a lot of the diseases that Kennedy, with his MAHA, idea, was coming to solve, is a lot of them I think would go away if we could get aluminum out of the environment, including through through inhalation, through water, through processed foods, etc. I mean, there's a lot of other things that contribute to making chronic disease. What, 70% of Americans have one?
I think that's about right.
Something
And then think about multiple.
And yeah, well, something over, I can't remember what the numbers are, but I think it's over 50% have more than one. Same in Canada, it's exactly the same. We are bombarded by a lot of toxic garbage that you would think the FDA and the CDC and the NIH would have been on top of, especially the CDC. But they're not. They're simply not. And
well, not until now. And I think that's one of the best things that's happening is we're becoming aware. People are waking up, realizing we're in this toxic environment. We got to do something because
absolutely,
our futures don't look great right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Kennedy, to his credit, is fighting against a very powerful machine. I mean, the pharma industry throws more money across both aisles of Congress than anything else, including defense, which is kind of remarkable, actually. And they basically, and we've seen it with the Senate hearings, they basically attack them. These are pharma-driven attacks, and even someone like Saunders, who may otherwise be a reasonable person, is basically, he is, sad to say, I mean, he's bought and paid for by the pharma. They all are.
And and I think that's that's what they're doing. They're getting all that out and trying to start fresh, get good people in there that are going to do the right thing and not be bought by pharma. And that's just
it's a huge problem. And you see a lot of them have been sabotaging Kennedy's work at every turn. What, I can't remember what her name is, but the recent CDC director who was just replaced was basically going against his recommendation, actually his orders, and she had to be fired. And he's going to have to do that, and then you're getting all this pushback from any number of levels. Yeah. And
well, then you have all the media. So the media is completely still biased. It's still censored. And that's what's one of the most frustrating things. That's why I'm trying to do stuff like this, because you won't find this on the media. You won't.
Well, you remember who the media gets paid by.
Right.
I mean, look, in America, you guys have direct to consumer advertising. We don't hear so much.
Oh, okay.
But our national broadcaster is bought and paid for by our government. So, when we look at we used to look at what's called the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as, yes, they got government money, a lot of it, but they used to be more balanced, a lot more balanced. And it's now you're dealing with back in the day, Pravda in the Soviet Union. They are the government spokesperson. Anything the government says, they do. And they will slant their news to make it come out that way. And so, for example, people like Steve Pellick, my co-author on the two books, co-editor, correction. No, we get nowhere with it because they don't even talk to us. They don't listen to anything critical of government policy about COVID or anything else. It's just, again, it's like dealing with Pravda. And those who people who remember that, whether they're Russian or not, you're dealing with a state-controlled information entity. And so when you combine the resistance of the medical establishment, both in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, you combine it with the pressure of the pharma and politicians who are bought and paid for, or ignorant, or both, and you add to that the controlled media, the chances for independent inquiry to come out for the population is very small. Again, thank you for what you're doing, because that's the only place it happens. You for example, I don't know if you've heard about the ostrich issue up here.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the government entity called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has decided about 400 ostriches need to be culled. Now, ostriches are very big birds. Some of them had the H5N1 virus. Most of them got better. They are now disease-free, and the government still wants to cull them. Okay, it's a longer story. But the point is that, with all the science proving that this agency is wrong, they don't know what they're talking about. Their arguments for the culling animals that are healthy are ridiculous. I mean, just pathetically ridiculous and unscientific. And yet they're still going to go ahead with it. And I think it's even starting today. They're going to kill 400 birds. These are very valuable animals.
Oh my gosh.
They also make antibodies against the H5N1 because they've had the disease. Those antibodies could be enormously valuable for people. But at the same time, part of the thing we're looking at here is our government apparently has bought 500 million doses of H5N1 vaccine. Gee whiz, I wonder if there's some relationship here between the fact that the government will not reconsider this in the slightest. So it's gone to our Supreme Court, which will probably decline to rule at all, which means the government will go ahead and slaughter these birds. And by the way, again, that's part and parcel of everything we've seen. That would happen throughout COVID. That was exactly what was happening. For example, we have here in Canada something called judicial notice. Have you heard of that? And you must have it there too, to some extent.
Yes, I'm not familiar, very, very familiar with it.
Okay, basically the judicial notice is things that don't have to be discussed because they're obvious. So, for example, do we have to talk about whether water is wet? No, water is wet. Okay. Do we have to talk about whether the sky is blue on a sunny day? No. Do we have to talk? Yeah, et cetera. Whether the moon, whether the moon is in the sky? No, those things we take. But they've applied it to medical issues as well. So when the public health officer here in British Columbia or elsewhere in Canada says these vaccines are safe and effective, and you go to court trying to show that they're not, the court goes, oh, well, no, the chief medical officer says they are. We're done. That conversation is over. And an expert witness, such as my colleague Steve Pellick, who knows more about immunology and biochemistry than any public health officer in this country by a lot, well, he doesn't get considered an expert witness because, of course, judicial notice. They're always right because water is wet. Well, so they don't even let the other evidence come in. And this has been a huge problem here when you're trying to fight back against mandates and against damages that are done to people. They just, it can't be because so-and-so says it's not true. So that's kind of where we are with our judiciary. I mean, yours is a little more independent.
Right. Well, the biggest issue I see is that it's going to take our healthcare practitioners a long time, if ever, to accept that there are harmful things in vaccines, because I'm a pharmacist, and it's like, so I didn't go to school for 7+ years, dedicate your life and your money and everything to find this out, and then find out that you potentially were causing harm by promoting those vaccines. That's not, and it's not any of the healthcare providers' fault. We were taught that way. We were taught safe and effective.
You're taught that way. And that's in my medical school, that's what they teach too, safe and effective. and
And
criticizing
you don't
it.
really dive into it. It's just, it's safe and effective. You follow the schedule. We didn't
That's
really
right.
learn about inactive ingredients. And so when I found out about aluminum, because I have a child that's autistic, I've been, so I'm always researching. When I found that out, that's what was the turning point for me, was like, oh my goodness, what is this doing in there? And then I really got deep diving in.
Well, the path to success in medicine in Canada, at least, and I suspect the United States, is not by questioning the authorities.
Right.
So, that gets you branded pretty quickly as an anti-vaxxer. And, the medical students that I have taught, one of the classes on child development, they make the case that it couldn't possibly be vaccines involved in ASD because Andy Wakefield was debunked, and that's it. They include an article by the Canadian Medical Association that says, Andy Wakefield, he's just a liar, and therefore the whole idea that there could be anything wrong with the vaccines is completely out of the question. And that's what the medical students learn. And the career path is not to question authority, and that doesn't help your progression in medical
school. That's not good medicine. That's not good practice. I mean, to me, it's like you want a physician that is questioning everything and trying to problem solve, and it should be personalized. But I mean, that's just we have a long ways to go, I think, to get to where we're actually healing.
We do, and so whether or not Kennedy has got the aluminum out of vaccines, he's actually made it a question that is now discussed. So 2 years ago, that conversation couldn't happen. It wouldn't have happened at the CDC, NIH, or anywhere. And in fact, if you wrote a grant to look at it, it was like instantly triaged. For example,
were you ever, because you have publications on aluminum, were you ever afraid, I guess, fearful for your life, maybe because
I know Exley was, because he used to ride his bike back and forth from his university to his house, and I thought, easy target, like the guy's on his bike, and he, he's made some major enemies in the aluminum industry. But what happened in my case was, for example, we had applied. I worked with a really amazing research associate named Lucia Tomlenovic, who's first author on a number of our papers about the HPV vaccine. And we wrote a grant soon after she came to my laboratory to the equivalent of the NIH called the CIHR, Canadian Institute for Health Research. And we were going to say something like, okay, we want to study aluminum in all of its manifestations in the human environment. So we want to look at, aluminum in water, aluminum in food, aluminum in air, aluminum in vaccines. I think we mentioned the V word once in a 25-page grant. 3 reviews came back from CIHR. One of them was going to maybe interesting, but not so much, and because aluminum's not interesting. And the other 2 basically said, oh, well, there's no point to do this study because Andy Wakefield was debunked. So wait a minute, what's this got to do with Andy Wakefield?
Right.
He didn't. There's no aluminum in the MMRs. Like, why is this even showing up in a grant review?
Huh.
And needless to say, we didn't get the money, and but that's the kind of thing you could not get past a review panel, because they are, like the medical students, like a lot of medical authorities, they are resistant to the idea that this thing could be harmful. And so, and the way to make sure it doesn't get studied is not to fund it.
Right. Have you ever been bribed to change an outcome of a study?
No, sadly, I wish I had. Because but no one ever said, shut up and don't do it. Because they don't have to. Now, bribery might come out, so we'll just make sure he never gets money. And they're very good at that.
Right. So it's not giving the money.
I remember, but I was warned through colleagues who had similar experiences. One of them went on to become the director of the Canadian Health Institute. He kind of became a little less radical, shall we say, and a good researcher from the States. And they basically they'd all noticed, both of them had noticed, there was an association between aluminum next to some of the hallmark proteins in both Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease. And they said, oh, that's kind of interesting. Why is that stuff in there? Good question. Okay. And in both cases, they literally had people kind of coming up to them and saying, I think that's an area you don't want to study. And they both told me that. They said, Chris, just walk away from it, because you're just going to get in trouble. You're just going to get, they'll kill your grants. They'll, and they do. And there was a wave of forced retractions of papers by everyone who was working on aluminum back starting about 2017. And they would just go back retrospectively, and the journals would be pressured to pull research studies that implicated aluminum out of the journals. It happened time and time again.
I saw a couple of those. Can we talk? So you had one in 2017. It was the title was Subcutaneous Injections of Aluminum at Vaccine Adjuvant Levels Activating Immune Genes in Mouse Brain that are homologous biomarkers for autism. So in that one, it stated that aluminum adjuvants promote brain inflammation and may appear to be more susceptible to aluminum's toxic effects. And so that study was retracted. So why?
It was.
And why
was it retracted?
Yeah.
I still think the study was correct. It was retracted because the first author had removed the data from the laboratory. So when questions came up about some of the images, and these were control images, by the way, again, the rule at UBC and elsewhere is the original data never leave the lab. That's a standard rule, and we've always accepted that as being correct. You could take copies of it, but you can't take the original. And she went back to China and she took her data with her. We didn't know that. So when the questions came up about these images, some of them seem to be duplicated. We looked, and you have to look really hard because these are tiny little images. We looked and we said, some of them do seem to be duplicated. So I contacted her and I said, can you show us where you left the original data? And she said, oh, it's in China with my parents. Okay, well, that's not good. So because we couldn't confirm, and we later did, we later found the images, but at that time, because we couldn't, I retracted the paper. So when they say, it was retracted, it was by me. I went to my VP research. I went to my chair. I went to other people in the journal itself, and I said, look, we got a problem. I don't know how to solve this. I think for now, we'll pull the paper back. We can find the original images. We'll do something else. But right now we couldn't. And by the time we found them, it had been long retracted. So
can you republish it though, if you have that data or those images?
We do, but we would have to update the data. And of course, again, with no laboratory money, you can't do that. And again, the original researcher was gone. So I mean, it was sad because I think it was real. And I think it was telling us, which is not a surprise, that it would interact with genes because we know it does.
And so that study, what was it that made you think that there was more susceptible to aluminum toxic effects than the adjuvant versus just like aluminum exposure?
Well, because that's what we had used. We had injected the adjuvant. Okay, so could it be other things? Of course it could. But we already were part of doing a study that was looking at aluminum adjuvant actions on both behavior and cell structure, and so we had that tissue left over. And this new postdoc came in and said, "Well, listen, I could do this genetic analysis," and I thought, "Well, great idea. Well, let's see how far into every level of the body it goes." And again, I think the data were real, but again, we couldn't. Yeah. I would love to do it again, but unfortunately, we couldn't with those.
You need the grant money.
And the samples are long gone, so we'd have to do it again. Again, it's not impossible to do, but again, after that incident, there was no way it was going to get funded again. Right. I think there is something to that. I think if someone were to do the study, they would find the same thing. Yeah. So anyway, that was a retracted paper.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I was just curious on that one.
And I want to emphasize though that it was retracted by me. And we have a concept. It doesn't usually apply anymore, which it should. It's called ministerial responsibility. In other words, if you were the head of a unit in the military or in civilian life, and somebody subordinate to you screws up, basically you own it. It's yours. Because the blame always has to go upwards, and that person who's the supervisory role is supposed to not let that happen, and it does happen. So, for example, at my university, there's the exact same thing. Someone who's studying prostate cancer apparently has had 30, not one paper, 30 papers questioned for image duplication. Is there anything going on? They don't care. But when you're talking about aluminum, we're talking about vaccines. The scary V word. All of a sudden, oh my God, this is horrible. We've got to crush this like a bug. So, basically that study had to be sanitized, had to be taken out, and anything that mentioned it, I had to go through and remove any reference to that paper.
Wow.
Yeah. So
It's wild.
yeah, it was crazy.
And you had a study looking at aluminum adjuvants that was linked to the Gulf War illness that compared
Yes.
mice given aluminum hydroxide and
Yep. Yep.
squalene that was in the
Yep.
adjuvant versus mice not given it. So what did those findings show?
Okay, that was our first paper. And it came about because we were studying a disease called ALS-PDC, which is
Okay.
the Guamanian form of Lou Gehrig's disease.
Right.
And it describes what's called a geographic cluster. In other words, a lot of people with the same disease in a relatively small geographic space. So we said, that's really interesting. Okay, and we studied that for years. We have a whole story with that. But a graduate student that had come into the laboratory and I said, listen, let's go find another cluster of neurological disease because that will give us more clues to what's causing it, maybe on Guam. And we settled on Gulf War syndrome because Gulf War syndrome has a lot of the characteristics, at least for the neural stuff, as did this Guamanian disease. A lot of people got one of the age-related neurological diseases, but they were not 60-year-olds, they were 25-year-olds.
Okay.
So there was increase in Parkinson, an increase in Alzheimer's, increase in, and there was, and a whole host of other multiple organ system dysfunctions. So we said, okay, well, that was linked at the time. They were saying, they were talking about oil well fires, and they're talking about depleted uranium, and the anti nerve gas drugs that soldiers were supposed to take. But it also, the disease also showed up in people who hadn't been deployed. So they weren't getting anything, but what they were all getting is multiple vaccines. Something like 24 vaccines in the course of a couple of weeks. 5 or 6 of them were supposed to be the anthrax vaccine. So we got curious about the anthrax vaccine. We went to the company Bioport and said, hey, can you sell us some? We want to do an experiment. They just laughed, said, no, no, we're not selling you anything. And we said, okay, well, that's fine. I understand that. And we looked at the vaccine ingredients, at least the ones that were listed on their spec sheets. Said, well, a big one is aluminum hydroxide. Hey, let's do a simple experiment. Let's just inject this. We'll take young mice that are kind of age equivalent to young soldiers. We'll inject them subcutaneously with aluminum hydroxide, this somewhat similar formula, almost the same formula that was in the anthrax vaccine, which turns out to be similar to many vaccines. And we'll see what happens. And we'll watch them around for a while, and then when they're sacrificed, we'll look inside the spinal cord and brain. And what we saw is very quickly they lost motor function, and very quickly they began to show kind of cognitive deficits. And when you studied the brain, into the histology of the brain, it was pretty obvious that a lot of cells were dying, and both in motor neurons and spinal cord and brain. We thought, oh, gee whiz. We just thought it was just we were going to study it and it was going to go away and it was going to be a master's thesis. There's nothing to it. Well, there was something to it. Did it again, got the same thing, and with more data, and that's kind of launched us on the path saying, well, okay, maybe aluminum vaccines is not good for you, and maybe not equally for everyone, but it's not good at least in our, again, it's a mouse model. There's always people who say, well, mice are mice, and people are sure. But that's why in basic biomedical research, rodents are used because they are close enough in many responses that you can say, okay, if it happens in our mice and our rats, there's a reason to believe it might happen in humans as well. That's not the end of the story, but that's a good reason to continue doing the research to see how broadly it applies.
Well, what blows my mind is that we have, so any drug trials have animal models to prove safety before they go to human trials.
Not always. They sometimes do them after. Yeah.
Okay,
They're supposed to. They're supposed to do preclinical trials.
Preclinical, right.
Yep.
So my thought is though, if we're having animal studies showing harmful effects from aluminum or other substances, then how can they be in our, how are they getting approved to be in our products?
Well, you would think the precautionary principle would still apply, but it doesn't. In other words, you have to prove that it's harmful rather than them having to prove that it's safe. Yeah. And that's essentially what happened. And for example, in the case of aluminum, they say, oh, we've been doing this for 80 years, must be okay. We'll just grandfather it. And that's basically what FDA and CDC did. They said, well, they've been putting this stuff in vaccines since the 1920s, and it seems to boost the immune response, which it does. And therefore, it's got to be fine. Because listen, we the same stuff one of the formulations is aluminum potassium sulfate, which you can still go to the grocery store and buy because you use it to make pickles if you want to have a lot of aluminum in your diet, and people still buy it. My grocery store has it in little packages. Okay, and therefore, if it's okay to make pickles with it, how bad can it possibly be for your body? Well, again, remember, this is the 1920s. They didn't know much about aluminum toxins.
Right. Well, and that's why I think the U.S. has that generally recognized as safe through the FDA, and that's why I think everything on that list needs to be reevaluated, because many of them haven't been reviewed since the 1970s, and the amount of studies that have come out, on aluminum since then is just wild. I think
well, a lot of things on the list have never been reviewed. So Kennedy should be creating this office, or whoever's running the FDA should be saying, okay, every year we're going to go back and look at this again. Is there new data coming out that said, let's say Tylenol, we should be looking at Tylenol all the time. We should have all the time. We should have been looking at a whole number of other toxic substances that are in food, and water, and and air. And we don't. We simply don't do that.
Now it's a catch up. Now we have to go back and do all the things that we're not done. And I feel like we could take a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach, which is what we have been doing.
That's right.
For our safety.
And it would cost money to do that. But I mean, there are a lot of things that should be done in research. We create this branch of NIH that's, let's go back and look at this again. And a lot of Johnny Unitas from Stanford and others have been calling for this. These things need to be reevaluated. Negative data are valuable too. Yeah. But just because someone says this and shows one result, make someone duplicate it. Somebody who's not connected to the first folks, go do the experiment again. Follow the same protocols, see if it's true. We don't do that. We rarely do that. And yet that has to happen. And so again, that needed to happen with things that are potentially, actually, the literature on aluminum toxicity, at least in food, goes back to the 1800s. So they've known this for a while.
Yeah, that's what I kind of found through my research too. Is it's been known for a while that it's a neurotoxin.
Yeah,
and then it's
but it's the same way. The Valera study in 2017. Anyone who read that, which I did, should have said, "Wait a minute, probably not a good idea to use mRNA because guess what? It's not staying where you put it. You said it was going to. It does not." Right. And the methyl uridines that you put onto onto the mRNA, they're not staying there. Or the spike protein is different. And again, it's not sticking where you put it. Okay, well, and again, if it's showing up, if it's showing up in breast milk and showing up in the fetus, probably there's a problem here.
Yeah,
that should have stopped it. But again, remember, they were so panicked with the emergency use authorizations. You know how those come about. You can only use those in Canada, the United States, different names, but the same idea, if there is no other alternative treatment. That's why they got rid of ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, because those would have said, well, for a lot less money, with two products that have been out there for, in the case of ivermectin, over 50 years, that are have an enormously successful safety ratio. No, it doesn't work. It's horrible. It doesn't work at all. So we're not. And in fact, in Canada, they were banned. You couldn't buy them anywhere. You literally could not get either product.
That's just crazy.
The only answer for the vaccine for the disease was take shots.
Well, because they wouldn't have been able to be an emergency use.
They could not.
Authorization if they would have had that.
So and the papers that supposedly debunked those two drugs were retracted because they were imaginary studies. Both of them.
Yeah.
And yet that was the basis on which mostly the various health agencies basically said, oh, the only way out of the pandemic, mirroring Bill Gates, is through vaccines. When there's a shot in every arm, then we're out of the pandemic and we go back to normal. That was the whole selling point. They called ivermectin horse paste. Mm-hmm. Okay, but you could get you can get tablets of ivermectin. You used to be able, you still can in Mexico and other countries. Yeah. But the people were going to veterinary stores and buying it horse paste, because same stuff, same purity levels as the human product.
Right.
But you couldn't get it. Literally, you could not go into a store and buy it.
Yeah, it's just crazy. But I'm in a way thankful that it happened, because we wouldn't be having the transformation and everyone waking up and making progress. If it didn't happen, I don't think we would be doing what we're doing today.
It's true. So,
We're going today.
but we paid an enormous price to be doing what we're doing
Absolutely.
today. And, you know, a lot of sick people, a lot of deaths. I mean, I don't think they've really calculated how many people around the world have died from these products, but I think the number is enormous, in the millions.
Yeah.
Certainly in the United States and Canada. I mean, the failure to use products that would work, the failure and the push for the COVID vaccines, even when the evidence was coming in that they do not stop transmission or infection, was just criminal. And, you know, they've harmed a lot of people. And, you know, there are people out there still taking shots.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about it's still happening, and a lot of us don't even know the future repercussions either. Or if you were pregnant during that time, what were those repercussions? We don't know.
Well, wait till the neurological stuff starts kicking in, because neurological, I mean, they've seen the turbo cancers, they've seen the cardio issues, they've seen other things, but neurological stuff takes longer to emerge. And we're starting to see the beginning of that. And I think a lot of people are neurologically damaged. I know a whole bunch of people took the shots. They did it for reasons, you do it to protect grandma, or you do it because you want to travel, or you do it because you need to work. And a lot of people had those reasons. I don't think they're great reasons, but let's pretend they are. But a lot of them, and I know some of them, are neurologically not the same as they were. And these are people who were very, very neurologically competent. They were people in professional people who had all kinds of demanding jobs. They were very, very smart, and a lot of them really lost their cognitive abilities. And so that long COVID, some of it may be the virus, but a lot of it is also the shots, I think. Right. And a lot of the damage we've done, I think we're only beginning to see the damage emerging for the neurological stuff, but we're seeing it in children, the impact on children. And all the moms who got vaccinated to protect your baby from COVID, you're going to see the consequence in the children. I think we're beginning to see a rise in ASD in the children born during that period. And I suspect that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see a lot.
Because it could possibly causes inflammation in the brain, which is a driver.
It can, and you're going to cause inflammation in the brain when you're all of a sudden getting your microglia to attack your resident immune cells, to attack these contaminated cells. And I think we're going to see a lot of that going on. So I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, do you think there's spike protein protocols? I think like Dr. Peter McCullough has one. Do you feel like those are effective, or do you feel like those will help? I don't know much about them. I haven't looked into them specifically.
We don't. We've just, within our CCCA group, we do a roundtable every Wednesday. And we, because we look at everything, and we criticize in a scientific way everything. So when the McCullough protocol came out, he gave a talk to us, and we looked at it and said, okay, is nattokinase going to do this? And the other formulations. And we looked at it, maybe. It's a little bit non-selective. It's a little bit like trying to chelate your aluminum with EDTA or something like that. You're going to get a lot of other stuff. So when you put in the nattokinase, yes, it's not really a kinase, by the way. It's a protease, but so it degrades protein, and yes, it will cross the barrier from your intestine if you take it orally into your blood, and it will then go and degrade various proteins. But do you want them all degraded? So that has not been addressed by McCullough, as far as I know. I think he's a really good scientist. I think he's a good guy, and I think it's a desperate need to get people better, and I think he's tried to do that. And so look, if this works, great. And he claims he's had success with it. A lot of other companies are coming up with some similar formulations, which is good, because if you can prevent these people from going down that path to various kinds of illnesses, great, sure, absolutely. But again, how well do they actually work? And I suspect we'll see variations on these that are more effective, that are more selective, and as we go forward. But it is essential, because insofar as, I don't know what the percentage in the United States, how many people took the double jabs. Canada's about 80%.
Probably higher here.
Yeah, and maybe. But what that tells me as a researcher is if 80% of the people have taken the 2 shots, you have 80% of the population that are now potentially sick. That's pretty scary. And think about
Well,
what
and
that.
additive effects too. I mean, if you consider
Yeah.
other vaccines or other
But
toxins and
absolutely. But and again, that builds into the whole MAHA stuff. You're surrounded by a toxic world. So you have, again, when you have 70% of the population has a chronic illness, 50% have 2 or more, what does that mean for the functioning of a society? For example, here we have a lot of people in essential industries who are not functional. We have a lot of police who can't function, a lot of the military can't function, ferry drivers. I live on an island, and a lot of ferry workers don't show up. So ferries are canceled. And when you have, and that's just the opening stages of this. What happens when you now have a really chronically ill, 80% of the population? What happens to your society? Now what? What are you going to do now?
yeah.
And so when our public health officer here a couple of years back was so proud to announce that 98% of surgeons in British Columbia have been double vaccinated or boosted. Oh, that tells me in a couple of years we don't have 98% of the surgeons. Okay.
Right.
So,
Well, I know how I had got the COVID vaccine because at that time I'm not where I was then. I was a new pharmacist and I didn't even question anything. And I had an inflammatory arthritis that developed later, and it was debilitating. Like I couldn't even go up the stairs. It was debilitating. And luckily I got past that and just made some changes. But yeah, for society, for everyone to be living like that, it's just, you're trying to raise kids and you're exhausted and it's not good.
Well, society, when you have that level of chronic illness, society is not going to function. And now what? And again, when someone gets a neurological disease or a cancer, someone else in the family, typically, especially in the United States, it's more because the healthcare is not as broad unless you have the money. In Canada, our healthcare system, by the way, is falling apart, even though it's supposed to be universal. But when you have that level of illness, someone in the family is going to come out of their job to take care of that person. And I've seen that time and time again. So now you've lost not only the person who's sick from the workforce, you've lost a caregiver.
Yeah. Well, now you throw in autism spectrum disorder, which I have a child with autism, and
that's right.
That is just a whole nother world, and that removes many people from the workforce. I'm so glad it's being talked about because the severity of how it affects families is real. And
it is absolutely real. And again, if you're Bill Gates and, assuming he has a kid with autism, he's fine. He can afford all the nannies in the world and all the caregivers, 24/7. The rest of us can't. And so again, what are you going to do? You're going to take care of your relative or your kid or your grandma or not? If not, well, that's not a very good place to be for a society to be. And if yes, then you are down to a lot less of a salary than you had before. And what are the implications of that? Because we know that poverty, look what happened to life expectancy in the Soviet Union when it fell apart. Life expectancy plummeted, alcoholism went up, child and spousal abuse went way up. Society was not functioning for a long time. And we are likely to, in my view, to experience the same thing here. I think we're going to see a lot
unless
more
we start to turn things around and figure out solutions, which
That's
hopefully, I'm hopeful.
Well, for example, here, our emergency department, the wait time, and where I live, the wait time to get into emergency in the hospital typically is about 8 to 12 hours.
Okay. Wow. For the emergency room?
Yep. And so my little boy, I have a 5-year-old who fell down last year, and he's a very typical kid. He fell down, he cut himself over one eye, and his mom took him to emerge, and they said, "Oh yeah, we'll get around to it in about 12 hours." So she and her partner basically said, "Well, screw that. That's ridiculous. We'll just put steri strips on it," and they did, and it was fine. But there's a local clinic. A lot of people don't have family doctors here.
Okay.
And the wait time in South Cowichan Clinic is, well, let's put it like this: they open at 9. If you're not standing in line at 7, you're not getting in that day.
Oh my gosh.
and you can't make appointments. So now you basically, a lot of people, I don't want to get up every day at 7 a.m. to get in to see a doctor for 2 minutes who's going to throw some pharma product at me.
Right.
And so, how are you functioning, if there's no healthcare, et cetera? I mean, well, yeah, I mean, there are alternatives, but you've got to build those. And we don't do that. We haven't done that. And so you basically, people are now going without the healthcare that they should be getting. I suspect it's true in the United States.
Yeah. Not to, I wouldn't say to that extreme, but.
Well, it's pretty extreme here. And yet we have, we have so-called universal health care that we pay for enormously with our taxes, and it doesn't work. And we simply, we tend to say, oh, we're better than the Americans because, we have this universal health care and everything's free. Yeah, but it's not free if you can't get in.
No. Yeah. Yeah. Major issues. Well, I mean, it's going to be some growing pains, I feel like, but hopefully, I'm hopeful at least here that we figure some things out and that carries over to other countries too, but we will see.
Well, I mean, I think that's where Kennedy has the potential to do an enormous amount of good, because what HHS does, and again, the time frame he's got is probably short. I mean, Trump is not as popular as he was.
Right.
There's a midterm election coming up in the United States. Midterms are coming up this time next year, November.
Mm-hmm.
If he loses seats in the House or in the Senate, a lot of Kennedy's stuff is going to get, I think, attacked more than now, and they can stop him. And so I don't think he's got a long time to actually get these things going. And then, of course, the Pharma is going to come roaring back, and they're going to, and the solution to your illnesses that we gave you are more of our products. Always.
Yep.
They have very, very good strategists. They know what they're doing. And, the idea is to keep everyone chronically sick so you can sell more stuff.
Well, and that's why I want to learn as much as I can from people like scientists like yourself that have been leading the way and have done so much research that we can utilize. So a lot of times I feel like we have the answers that we just have to put them together. We have different research in different areas, and although it's talking about mitochondrial dysfunction over here and oxidative stress over here, but then you can see how it all connects and goes together. And that's also why I got so stuck on aluminum, because it does all those things. It impacts mitochondrial dysfunction, gut dysbiosis, oxidative stress, inflammation, methylation. It affects everything, and that is what we see in these kids, and why there's probably such a spectrum. But
I mean, no, you're absolutely right, and that's why they need to put a lot of money into that, rather than people having to beg and borrow money to do this research. Put a pot of money together. Money exists, and take 100 independent scientists, give them all $1 million. Okay, now you just gave 70 billion to Pfizer. Just give 70 million out to aluminum research and empower a bunch of people and say, come back and tell us what you find.
Right. See, and I want specific studies though. I want to know, like hair mineral tests. How accurate is that at telling us what the level of aluminum is in the brain? Like, do you know, is it accurate, or is it much higher because it's intracellularly and we're not getting a lot of that?
And we don't know, so we can't really calculate the amounts. And I mean, with something like aluminum, there's no safe amount. Right. I mean, you may not show overt symptoms with lower doses, but it's always going to do harm. There's no way that aluminum is not going to screw up your cellular function. It just does. Again, biological systems have enormous redundancy and capacity to overcome some of these things for a while. And that's a little bit like, we're talking about with age-related neurological diseases. You can overcome up until you reach this threshold of loss, and then you can't anymore. Then you get what's called a cascading failure. Okay, but if you could stop that process earlier on, you probably get through. I mean, if you don't get one of these diseases, if you don't have aluminum doesn't damage or create other diseases, you'll live to 120, get run over by a bus. Okay, that's at least you made it to 120. But these other diseases are, again, they're devastating because they take people out of their productive lives. They take people out of their families. They wipe out families, right? And yet they could be prevented. And you could expect, and of course, we're seeing it. The pharma is fighting tooth and nail to protect their products, and they control the Congress. And again, here they control, they don't directly control our parliament, although I'm sure a lot of people in our parliament have taken money from them. But they've convinced the government, which also has a financial stake in these vaccines, to keep doing the same thing. Just everyone who doesn't agree with that is just a conspiracy theorist or.
Well, I'm hopeful that is changing. I mean, I've seen a lot of movement, I guess, just on social media with people just being at least curious and asking questions and, kind of figuring that out, that piece. And so that's exciting to me that we are, I feel like the more people that learn this and move towards that, the better off we're going to be, because you have more people supporting that and backing that and understanding really what's going on. So I feel like that's shifting and that's happening, but
it is.
You need a lot more momentum.
But you do, but look at a lot of the so-called woke club. I come from a background, I was kind of a lefty for a while. And I remember doing an interview with my university newspaper, it's called UBC, and they called me up and said, some radical groups on campus are saying that you're a racist. What? And because you're questioning COVID vaccines and aluminum in vaccines. So you must be an anti-vaxxer, and anti-vaxxism is racism and colonialism.
Oh my gosh.
Are you serious? Colonialism? How did you get from A to Z that fast?
Right. Huh? What happened there?
Yeah, but I mean, there've still been protests. I mean, a lot of the kinds of groups that I knew back in the day are protesting people who want safe vaccines. What? When did you become an agent of the state and Bill Gates? Like, you're supposed to be against that stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's
bizarre. It's clown world. It's completely, it makes no sense.
It does not make any sense. I know. I did have a few more questions though.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, the aluminum. I just want to, since you've done research on this, how it's causing damage in the brain. Is it oxidative stress and neuroinflammation, basically, that it's causing, or it's having the most effects?
I think that's one of them. I mean, I think aluminum has the potential to basically, yes, there's what's called an kind of indirect Fenton reaction is creating free radicals. Okay. I think the biggest problem, of course, is that aluminum is creating the inflammation, and it is gumming up the cellular work so that the cells don't, excuse me, produce the proper proteins and the proper, don't have the proper structure of function. It interferes with so much stuff. It interferes with synaptic transmission. It interferes with the balance between so-called microglia and other glial cells and neurons. And it directly can damage neurons. Opens ion channels. It does so many negative things. So I think what's happening in the brain is it's kind of massively assaulting a lot of cells and killing them. And the consequence of that is, you're again, in the case with Chris Exley, you're looking at a lot of the kind of hallmark proteins in some of the people. There was a Camelford incident. I've heard of that. So a lot of the people come down with, early onset Alzheimer's. And, it's basically the aluminum is going in and binding to cells and creating these toxic amyloids and toxic tau proteins that are essentially damaging cells and preventing normal function. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. And again, but aluminum is not good for any cells. I mean, it will damage cells anywhere. So there's a link that actually is done between breast cancer and aluminum in deodorants.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, and is that real? Yeah, very likely. But also, again, Exley has demonstrated. We've done it in animal models. Exley has done it with human studies. There's definitely a link between autism and the aluminum in the brain. It's there.
Some of the highest levels.
Some of the highest levels, yeah. And so people criticize the paper he published and say, well, he doesn't have controls. Yeah, but he's got a bank of data going back 20 years. He's got more controls in that data set than any other study I've seen. And so when you see these remarkably high levels, shouldn't be there. And given what we know about aluminum toxicity and what we know about aluminum kinetics, it can't be doing any good. So is it directly killing cells? Maybe. Maybe it's just making them not work as well. Maybe it's making them make abnormal function and connections. So again, but that's a problem that's solvable by a very little amount of money. Take someone like Exley or someone and say, here's $1 million. It's a lot of money in research. Go tell us what it's doing exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we need to know, because if you can't get the aluminum out, then does treating the oxidative stress and treating the inflammation component, and you'd have to continuously treat that by giving, maybe antioxidants or whatever is most potent at decreasing that inflammation, decreasing the oxidative stress. But I'm just thinking, if you can't get the aluminum out, what's the next best option? Because many of these kids are in, their critical development, critical brain development. And so the earlier you get these things on, the more likely they're going to have a better quality of life.
Yeah.
So that's just where I'm thinking is, what can we do while we're waiting for answers? Because so many parents, they're desperate. They're trying to figure out, what's going to help. And I luckily have figured out that magnesium, NAC, a strong probiotic, has been very successful for us in getting off all medications. But many of these parents just don't even know where to start,
Well, and that a lot of autism is extremely severe. It's not just like, people have,
neurodiversity.
And not just, the cute indigo kids, who think a little bit differently. Right. But you have a case where you have people, and, Brian Hooker, who he is. He's got a kid who's in his 20s, is in diapers. And that's not unusual. That's, some large fraction of autistic kids are dysfunctional. Yeah. And what are you going to do with them? Ultimately, someone's got to take care of them. And so, the solution to aluminum things is, first of all, prophylactic. And Kennedy is right, or even Trump was right. You said you got to get it out. Well, you do get it out now, and then you still got to figure out what you're going to do about the pharma maybe trying to do something worse. But get it out now, and I think you'd see things change very dramatically. But then again, you also have to deal with the people who are now ill. They're maybe adults, and how you gonna can you do anything for them that's going to help them be more functional?
Because we don't know if it's actual damage done, or if it's the inflammation and things going on causing that. Right? We don't know if there's actual damage done, or if that is possibly reversible. Right?
Indeed. And again, these are problems that are solvable with money. That old expression, throw money at it. Yeah. And you're not talking about a lot of money. Look, the American defense establishment, they have B-2 bombers. What do they each cost? A couple of $1 billion? Okay. So, if Pete Hegseth really wants to do something good, he goes back to the budget office and says, look, I don't need 100 new B-2 bombers this year. I'll just take 99. Gee whiz. There's now $1 billion for biomedical research. The money it's not like the money.
I don't think the money's a problem. I think it's
money's not the problem.
Figuring out what the research needs to be and who's going to do it and getting that done. And that's what I'm concerned about. Is I want to make sure the right research gets done. Like, I want to make sure that it gets done to help the most people. Because in my opinion, I think almost any child should have a hair mineral test done. To see, and if it is present, it's there, even though it may not be accurate on which level in the brain it's there. And then there can be detox protocols or guidelines and insurance coverage, and you can just see where we can possibly go with this to get all these kids and families help.
Absolutely. But again, it has to be a two-pronged thing, because it would say, yes, you want to get them help, get the aluminum and other toxins out of them, and the other hand, don't add more toxins to the mix. Yep. In other words, stop doing what you're doing that's making these people sick in the first place, and then do something for them. And these things have to go in parallel, because otherwise, if you just keep, yes, we're just going to keep injecting you and keep giving you toxins in your food, but then we'll take it out. Well, that's kind of a.
You have to prevent that. Yeah, it has to start with being aware and preventing it. But then when the damage is already done, or there's already being effects, then we have to figure that out too. So it's definitely both.
Yeah, and again, Kennedy's faced with having to deal with a lot of people at NIH and CDC and FDA who are locked into the system, And you know that old expression, I think it was an Upton Sinclair quote that said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it." Well, a lot of people in those agencies don't want to understand it. They have their comfortable little niche, and they've been doing this way, and they don't want to rock the boat, and they're just going to keep doing it until they get fired or change their minds and hearts. And you know, there's got to be a philosophical and cultural change in those agencies.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that may take time. I don't know how much time there is to do that, because
in the
otherwise,
meantime, all these kids and families are suffering, and
that's
then
right.
you have more coming because they're still getting vaccinated.
Well, and no, exactly. So when Trump says, like no one should be injecting aluminum, he's right, but stop it now before it gets worse. Same way, stop the RNA vaccines. Yeah, yes, Kennedy is right. Free choice has to apply. If you really want to get one, go spend $100 and get one.
Yeah.
But we're not promoting it. We're not putting it on the schedule anymore. None of those things. And at least stop giving it to people routinely. And I think you'd see an enormous turnaround in health outcomes. You may take years to see it, but you would.
Yep. And I have to ask you on the other side of this,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on, the side of then these diseases, like the viruses and the diseases? That's the biggest argument, is that, oh, if you don't get vaccinated, then there's going to be outbreaks and we're going to see an increase in disease and we're going to see deaths from that. And what's your thoughts about that?
Well, my sense of it is that hasn't happened yet. So, they talk about, the measles, is going to come roaring back and everyone's going to die of measles. Well, it's not happened. Okay. And that what tends to happen with the viruses is viruses tend to become, as they evolve in the population, they become somewhat more infectious, but they'll also become less pathogenic. So I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think all of a sudden, if the measles, and again, I don't think Kennedy's talking about taking away the MMR shot, but again, let's do more research and to see, is it really a health hazard? And that no one's gone back to that for years. So, is measles the killer that we thought it was, or people thought it was?
Right.
And
Well,
it's not.
I've seen some graphs showing how it actually declined quite a bit before
vaccines.
Well,
it did.
Place. So how much is actually contributed to the vaccines, or how much is contributed to sanitation?
Okay, interesting. It's a good question you raised. So when you look at the historical data, the American census data for the 20th century, and you're right, all the infectious diseases had been declining before the vaccines for them came in. The vaccines may have lowered that declining level already, but they didn't, and some of them didn't do anything. But a lot of them may have given a small extra decrease, but they were going down that way anyway. And even the CDC, in one of their publications, they have their morbidity and mortality report that comes out in Internal House Journal, and which of course is not peer reviewed, but they actually report one of the articles. They say, well, vaccines have, they say the greatest medical invention of all time. They've saved billions of people. Okay, and then later on in the same journal, they say, well, yeah, vaccines contributed, but it was also change in housing. It was also change in nutrition. It was also change in water supplies. It was also, all these things contributed, which is true. And that's why all of the infectious diseases declined. Whether it was virus or bacteria or whatever, all of them declined in the United States and in Canada during the 20th century. So you were vaccinating against the declining curve already.
Yeah. So we don't actually know how much is contributed.
We don't actually know.
Yeah.
Again, could we do that study? For sure. And it's not even, none of these things are expensive in the grand scheme. And so, but one of the things that's become clear during COVID is fields like epidemiology and a lot of medical science about vaccinology. They've got some huge gaps, and they're based on assumptions that have never been tested. And so, for example, the models on COVID were just absurdly bad, You based on assumptions that are clearly not true. And that's why you get, you remember Neil Ferguson in the UK. We had a guy up here named David Fissman. They were projecting millions of fatalities. Nowhere near that happened. Okay. And they were based on a lot of assumptions that were just basically blatantly wrong.
Mhm.
And and epidemiology has a lot to answer for here, because these kind of models where they don't go back and check against real world data, they just make assumptions.
Mhm.
Other fields of science do the same thing. They're just incredibly inaccurate, and they lead to extremely bad policy. So is good modeling possible to do? Absolutely. Again, but it's not a one-shot thing. You make an assumption, for example, that every COVID vaccine is safe and effective and has no side effects. Well, that's not true. It's not true for anything. But
Mhm.
that led them to a lot of calculations based on the models that were wildly inaccurate.
Yeah.
And policy, unfortunately, you look at a lot of people in Congress or in our parliament, for example. They don't have the training. They don't know how to analyze stuff. Critical thinking is at a low ebb generally, but with politicians who have to be deciding these things, they don't have the knowledge or the
Right.
willingness,
To
for them,
understand.
to study it and to say, look, we're going to put aside a serious pot of money and we're going to figure it out. And
Mhm.
then, if the scientists, don't have in their uh, disclosure statement that, oh, by the way, I used to work for Pfizer for 10 years. Those people probably don't,
That's not, no.
probably don't want to include them in your, there are enough good scientists in the United States and Canada. You could do this work.
Yeah, I would love, I mean, so I actually just interviewed Dr. Theo Horitis. He's a mast cell expert,
Yeah.
research for 4 years, and he does world of knowledge. Take, you, him, Exley, get
Absolutely.
you all in the room and figure out, how much we could figure out if just from all of the knowledge of
You could.
scientists.
Yeah, and especially with aluminum, and the literature is huge now about the toxicity. So, for example, what I was surprised at, they announced 13
Yeah,
groups that were going to get funding. Have you looked at any of those groups?
I have not yet.
You should, because what they're all doing, and one of them, by the way, was
So all
CHOP,
genetics.
pretty much.
Yeah,
You look
that's
at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia,
oh
Paul
no,
Offit's group.
no.
They got money
Why?
because these are PR exercises. You funded these people for however many $1 billion, and what are they going to find? They're basically going to take a lot of stuff. They're going to do a lot of meta-analyses using the literature in a lot of the literature that's already very pro this stuff. They're going to then have machine learning, AI, tell them what it means. And what do you think they're going to find? They're going to find, oh, it's all safe and effective, just like we said. And oh, maybe aluminum is a little thing, but nothing to worry about, because the money is not being spent on the people who actually could answer the question. It's
Right,
all
where use our good scientists that we have. It's just I'm so
you have
frustrated
them.
with that. And like for Offit, for instance, if you Google anything about vaccines, children CHOP comes up, and Paul Offit has reviewed all of those. It's a little
That's right.
biased, and he has an mRNA, or he has a rotavirus vaccine. He's profited.
Yes.
It's just
Oh, he's made a lot of money. Yeah.
a lot of money from it. So that should not be the first thing when you Google a vaccine and try to find information. Should not be his reviewed articles coming up.
Yeah. I mean, so the way they've built that system, it's almost guaranteed not to find any. And they'll generate a lot of data, I have no doubt, and they'll do their modeling, and AI will tell them whatever AI tells them. And I suspect they'll find a way, like they have done with the CDC and the FDA in the past. You remember Frank DeStefano, how he basically crushed any idea that the MMR had any, or the thimerosal had any role whatsoever in autism. Okay. You ever read Simpsonwood?
Yeah.
Okay. And okay, so the Stefano was one of the main drivers there, and it was John Clemens, who was the WHO rep, who basically finished the conference and said, "What you're raising is very dangerous, because you're going to get people to not take the vaccines. And so if we get rid of
not everyone's going to know what this is. So Simpsonwood, if you want to, was this in 2000? This was like 2008, maybe?
No, 2000.
2000, okay.
Yeah.
And they had a kind of like a secret conference meeting,
Yeah.
right, where they discussed thimerosal and vaccines and the relationship to autism, and basically they presented evidence of it being potentially harmful, right? And then they basically buried it and said no.
They basically buried it. It was Thomas Verstraeten, who was then at CDC. He's now at FDA, and basically he said, "Look, we're seeing a signal here." and with thimerosal, we can't make it go away. That's an interesting statement. And basically he presented, and then reading the discussion amongst the scientists was interesting because a lot of them were worried. And then it was Clemens and De Stefano who basically, stopped it. And then Verstraeten then was made to do another study in which he added another HMO to his group study. And basically they got different results, and he just averaged them. He said, well, this one was positive, this one was negative, nothing happened. So he basically, he backed away from his own work, which was really, really interesting. And the Institute of Medicine, I remember, took a look in, I think it was 2008. They took a look, and they basically said, we don't know. We can't tell if this stuff is harmful or not.
But let's not look into it further.
Yeah. So we can't tell. We can't tell. So therefore, nothing needs to be done.
Yeah. Great. It's that's just crazy.
It is crazy. And so, while I would think Kennedy can do more, I do appreciate he's up against massive forces and institutional inertia that, I suspect we can't imagine how bad it is.
Yeah.
But again, if you don't do it now, a year from now, it's going to change. I don't know if Trump's going to have as much control of Congress.
Right. He's got to get as much done as possible. And
you got,
and I'm looking at it from a point of, if you have a child with autism, this next year is just critical, because what we can figure out, what the research we can get done, what we can do for these kids' development and their brains, and we have to push. We have to go full force and get the information we can. So I'm hopeful, but I'm just,
well, the same for me. I'm hopeful, but it's going to be tough. I mean, research doesn't happen overnight. So let's say tomorrow, Chris Exley gets $1 million, I get $1 million. And most of the researchers, by the way, that were doing aluminum research were outside the country, right? Because there was no funding for NIH, period. So most of us were getting money from other sources like philanthropy, and sometimes research grants. For example, in France, were being Girardi's group could get money. But there was no money in the United States. So most of the scientists who actually did the work, when they built the system for those 13 groups that got the money, if you were outside the United States, you couldn't even apply.
Oh.
Nobody could. If you were not associated with a United States institution, you were not applying for that grant.
Okay.
Period. And so all the people who mainly did their aluminum research over the last 15 years were instantly cut out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the problem.
Well, it is. I mean, there are some good people in the States, but again, I doubt if they were getting funded.
Right, but they're not looking at the same things, or they haven't seen the same things that like you and Exley have. So
yeah, exactly. And so again, if you got to spend some money to find this out, but again, you're not talking major money. You're just not.
Right, it's doable.
And so with Trump, his follow through, in my view, is not particularly good in a lot of things. I mean, Ukraine was supposed to be solved on day one. Well, it's not. The whole thing with Israel, Palestine, is nowhere near being solved. And they're waffling on the Maha stuff. And I think, unless the Maha people push back pretty hard, I don't think Kennedy's going to be able to do his job.
Yeah, we got to catch some momentum. So I mean, yeah, we just got to keep pushing. We got to get momentum.
Got to keep pushing. I mean, the good thing is the conversation is happening at a level that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago.
Well, that's why I want to do things like this, because these conversations are important, and as tough as they are to have and as raw as they are, it's important for people to understand that we have this type of research, and we have your expertise, we have Exley's expertise. It's not like we don't have anything, so we have things to go off of, and we need to keep getting more answers.
We do, and we need, again, it's made the discussion more possible to have, but up until now, basically you could not have a civil discussion between people who were very pro-vaccine, people who were asking questions. The pro people would simply not show up. They would not do it because supposedly, well, we're not going to talk to anti-vaxxers because they're all Luddites, and they all just want to kill your grandma, and they know nothing, they're ignorant, they're selfish. Okay, so no point to have a discussion with anybody except our own echo chamber. And that's what they've done until the ACIP, up until recently, was a rubber stamp. You have people who had no knowledge basically approving everything that came before them. They would have
Yep.
approved. They would have approved the phone book if it had been put in front of them.
Yep.
And the vested interest. Oh my God, the conflicts of interest in that group were just
Oh,
terrifying.
yeah. I mean, yeah. And when I had looked at the World Health Organization,
Oh yeah, them too.
that
Yeah.
was just, oh, I mean, that's, you just look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, what have we been doing?
Yeah. Well, but no surprise why they make the choices they make. And so unless you clean those up, and again, it's got to be soon because again, they're going to be there. They're, you know,
And
that vested interest. Yeah.
this is definitely, and it's a world issue. Like I had someone from Kenya reach out to me because of how how the damage that they've had from vaccines. And, you know, that person was trying to advocate and educate because of what they're seeing in Kenya.
Yep.
And so it just makes you realize like it's a world, like this is a world issue that we can't need to address.
Well, it's a world issue because the pharma are global. They own the world, and they operate in every country. And you know, a lot of the ones that used to be American, they don't care where they are. I mean, it's the same money pot. They'll get it from different governments. And you know the story in Kenya about the contaminated not HPV, sorry,
How's that Hepe?
Hep A vaccine, which is contaminated with gonadotrophic hormone for fertility. You know that story, right?
I not the details.
Okay, well, basically, some doctors, colleagues and I published on this. Some doctors from Kenya had come forward and they said, we think the vaccine is contaminated. It was supposedly for it was a tetanus vaccine, neonatal tetanus, which is a terrible disease. Okay. So we're going to vaccinate all the moms with this anti-tetanus vaccine. What they didn't tell the moms, what they didn't tell anybody, was that they had conjugated the human gonadotrophic hormone to it. And that's an anti-fertility.
Yeah.
And the idea was, well, you know, the people who were promoting it were trying to get rid of neonatal tetanus, but the pharmaceutical company had another agenda. And basically, they were looking at a third world has too many people. We're going to, you know, diminish that by making people infertile. Okay.
Oh.
And, you know, in a poor country like Kenya, we think, okay, well, you know, if it were offered as a choice, yes, you could prevent neonatal tetanus. And by the way, it's birth control. People might have taken it. But again, where was informed consent?
That's just
okay,
so
and it wasn't.
It's so bad.
It is. Well, okay, and informed consent as a topic, by the way, I'm still teaching at the moment in a teaching block, and a subject came up about informed consent. This was first year medical students, and they were talking, you know, as they should have, about informed consent. You need informed consent from your patients to do stuff. And these are students who've been through almost a year of medicine. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, it's a good topic. Let's talk about what that means. None of them had a clue. None of them had a clue. And they looked at me like deer in headlights. What are you talking about? What's informed consent? So, serious? You guys are going to be medical doctors. You have to know this.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And it's not emphasized. And of course, it has to be. And again, they violated it continually throughout COVID. Continually. You know, with incentives or punishments, which again, Nuremberg and the other codes on this are very, very clear that you cannot incentivize these things. You know, people have to know all the information and be given a choice. And if they say no, that's no. Nope, that doesn't happen.
Right, I mean, they're not given all the information.
No, and not letting people and then you have a choice as long as you choose correctly.
Right.
Well,
or it'll be not receive healthcare.
Yeah, or not receive healthcare. Yeah, and we've had cases here where people were denied transplants, essential transplants, because they were not vaccinated. They're dying from something, and you're not going to give them a life-saving transplant because they're not vaccinated against COVID.
Yeah, would that make sense?
Yeah, well, exactly. And in fact, one of our books, I think you have copies of the books. One of our books is dedicated to some of the victims here that died because they could not get a transplant because they were bumped from the list which they had been on because they were not fully vaccinated. Right. So, you know, because you won't take this poison, we're going to let you die. Because you're obviously an anti-vaxxer and an evil person, and you're going to kill grandma. Well,
Yeah, it's just, it makes no sense. It's
it
just,
makes no
we're
sense
just
at all.
pro-science. No one's anti-vax. It's just pro-science. It's pro-safety, pro-health.
Well, exactly. I mean, maybe some people are anti-vax. Fine, that they're entitled to an opinion. Okay,
Right. Yeah, that's fine.
that's fine. And vaccination. Somehow the idea. I think Aaron Siri, the lawyer, has a
Yeah.
book out called "Vaccines Amen." And there's another book by a Slovenian scholar, which basically look. I think it's called "The Ideology of Vaccination." It's become a cult religion. And again, this is like any. It's an article of faith for a lot of people, and especially in medicine. And that it's just, why to question that you're peeing in the holy water. Why would you do that? What's the matter with you? You just want to kill everyone's grandma. And so that conversation couldn't happen. In many cases, it didn't happen. And maybe at least Kennedy has allowed that to happen. And,
Yeah.
there's
It's
more
definitely happening. I mean, I'm seeing that definitely happen more and more, that you can openly talk
yeah.
about that and just not be ridiculed and not be called names and torn apart. I mean, there's still plenty of that, but it's at least
Yeah.
getting more supported, and people are at least like, oh yeah, let's actually talk about this and question it and make sure we're
Well,
doing the right thing.
what a lot of people haven't recognized is that when they say, oh, measles vaccine uptake is down, other vaccine uptakes, a lot of parents are saying, well, I have to question everything. Well, yeah, because you basically pulled this fraud, with the mRNA vaccines, and it's such blatant fraud that yeah, they're going to question everything you guys do. I mean, that would be true in any field, right?
That would make
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
makes sense. You're lying about that. Pfizer, is notorious, and I think Kennedy has called them serial felons, which they are. You guys have been lying. You get fined over and over and over again. You guys lie about everything. Why should we trust you on this?
Right.
Because COVID is going to kill everybody. Well, no, and the Robert Malone's, and I think it's McCulloch's work also, that shows that a lot of the deaths in the United States. When you saw one of the senators, grilling Kennedy and saying, "Do you acknowledge that 1 million people died because of the disease?" And he correctly said, "Look, we don't actually know, because a lot of people died because we were treating them inappropriately. We were hyperventilating people, which is often fatal. We were giving them drugs that didn't work, like remdesivir. We were basically preventing them from taking medications earlier that would have stopped the disease. And we treated it as if COVID is going to kill everybody who gets it, and this was never true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the consequence is a lot of people died who should not have died, because we put all our resources into things that were kind of doomed to fail.
Yeah.
So when they ask Kennedy, how many people, don't you know that 1 million people died? Well, let's really look at the numbers and see how many of them died from the actual disease. I have a colleague in Britain. She's a nurse, and she's very pro-vaccine, as many nurses are. But she was even wondering. She said, we had a traffic accident. A motorcyclist basically had an accident. He was decapitated, but he was found to have by PCR, which is highly problematic. He was found to have COVID, so they wrote him down as a COVID death.
Yeah.
And that happened a lot, right?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. So how could you possibly even know those numbers?
And how PCR can be manipulated, the cycle threshold, and that was ridiculous. I mean, when here they were testing at 38 to 40 cycles, where the cell phone it was going to test positive. It's 97% false positive with that. And yet those are your numbers upon which you're determining how many people have the disease and how many people died from the disease. It's garbage. This is the garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
You're not getting accurate number. You don't know.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was a mess. It is a mess.
Still is.
Yeah.
And see, as far as I know, CDC and the FDA have not backtracked from that. They're still holding on to those numbers. And Kennedy has got to go in and fire a lot of people. I mean, I would, frankly, if I were Kennedy, I mean, he can't do it, obviously, but I would go in there in the CDC and the FDA, and I would basically fire everyone down to the secretarial pool.
Well, I feel like that's what he's been doing.
Well, yeah, well, good, because let's start again. Let's build this.
I'm all for that. Let's just get new people, good people, people that are ethical, and start fresh.
Yeah,
100%.
people and people can't be bribed because they'll dangle a lot of money in front of them.
Yeah.
And yeah, people can't be bribed. And but you're in a race against time. You've got to do this before the regime changes again.
Yep.
If it's not, in 3 years, it'll be sometime. And you've got to get these institutional changes in place. Otherwise, the same powers that control healthcare in the
And
United
it just,
States
yep,
will
go back to what it was.
go back to what it was. And but now we got rid of that bad thing, aluminum. Now it's just mRNA for everything.
Right. Right. Yeah, we can't let something like that happen either.
No, you can't, because that given what we've seen with COVID, with the mRNA vaccines there, and even the viral vector vaccines, you're going to make even more people sick, and you start throwing this at everything. And both governments have approved for massive infrastructure changes to create more mRNA technology for everything. Yeah.
Hope not. I hope not. Hope things change around there. Before I forget, I did want to ask you too about how neuroinflammation, if that can impact primitive reflexes and vision, because a lot of times we see where there's retained primitive reflexes, and can that have something to do with these toxins causing inflammation in those certain areas of the brain where those reflexes aren't able to be adapted?
It could do, yeah. I mean, in terms of vision, I mean, where the main visual areas are visual cortex, which is the area that mostly interprets the signals that come in from your eyes. And yeah, I mean, the toxins go there too. Aluminum goes there. It goes
So
everywhere.
so if you have accumulation in those areas that's causing like oxidative stress or inflammation,
Yep.
you could
And
have
killing cells.
visual
Yeah,
changes and visual disruption.
absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, you go and do lesions in that part of the brain, you're going to have gaps in your vision. It just, or miscommunication in your vision. And it can be anywhere from the retina all the way up through to the visual cortex and to the higher association areas. That absolutely can happen.
Okay.
And we don't know, again, that's a study that someone like Exley could do. Show us where the aluminum goes in the brain. It probably goes everywhere.
Does it correlate with the symptoms that you'd see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what he looks at, he's mostly been looking at Alzheimer's areas, but he didn't have the capacity to look everywhere. It's a lot of histology you'd have to do, but you should. Someone needs to do that. Where exactly does it go and how much, and is there more here and more there? And it's going to depend on the population, depend on age, depend on a whole bunch of things. But yes, the answer is probably goes everywhere, and I don't think there's any reason you wouldn't expect aluminum to go everywhere.
Yeah. Okay. And then what about? So I've looked a lot into magnesium and how we may be really underrepresenting magnesium and its impact in the brain and the body because of everything it's involved in, especially like the NMDA receptor and how it's needed there to kind of prevent or block excitotoxicity or that firing. Do you feel like magnesium can make a difference if there is excitatory symptoms like in anxiety and aggression and mental health disorders? Do you feel like that's missing?
I do, but I again, how much has that been looked at a clinical level?
Right.
I think it could. I mean, insofar as something like aluminum might compete for those sites, I think it could.
So magnesium could potentially like displace aluminum.
Well, aluminum can displace magnesium, yeah.
Yeah.
And so again, you'd have to do that dose response curve and to see what level do you want every receptor site with the magnesium on it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But again, if you're trying to get rid of the aluminum, that might be a way. And again, I would imagine a lot of those receptors have aluminum bound to them. And
I know we have studies that say kids with ADHD, for instance, have, I think it's like 75 to 95% are magnesium deficient.
Yep.
And and then there's a lot of studies with other mental health disorders and deficiencies there because of our soil being depleted of magnesium. So I feel like that can just be beneficial potentially for a lot of kids.
Yeah, and also remember, the various things can interrupt the transport of magnesium into various organ systems. Okay,
Yes.
And so various toxins will do that; they'll compete. And the uptake may be very different for magnesium versus molecule X. And there's a whole series of studies that show competition curves. And have they been done? I don't think so. And again, have they been done in laboratory settings? Various private healthcare providers have done it, maybe, but I've never heard of an NIH study that did it.
Yeah.
Oh, not hard to do.
Right.
So I mean, again, you're looking at a lot that needs to be done to get the momentum really going, and again, short time to do it. That's why I was a little skeptical when Kennedy said last spring that he was going to have an answer to autism by the summer, by September.
You're like,
well,
no.
no. I mean, you just don't. I mean, all you can do for that time frame is you can do meta-analyses and throw money at these groups. And again, I don't know how they did that. That are not really able to do that kind of basic. They're not doing bench research. They're going to. One of them is going to work with what are called organoids.
Organoid.
Yeah, but most of them are not doing that. In my sense of looking at the grants, is that they're all going to be massive data collections based on AI, and AI is going to tell you what it means.
Yeah, I don't love that, but maybe I don't know. Maybe we can get more answers from that than I'm aware of. But I guess the organoids, I don't see the major benefit because you're looking at specific organs and not the overall body. And we have rat models are pretty good about giving us an overall picture of what's going on in humans.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little like anything in cell culture. Cell culture is a useful technique, but it's not the normal milieu of that organ, or include especially the brain. There are too many other things that are interacting. And when you take it, I'm just going to do this in neurons grown in a cell in a culture dish. Well, it's not how they really work. Right. And so you're getting a very lopsided view based on, again, this is a model, and models all have flaws, but the flaws here are actually quite enormous. And they are not necessarily giving you an answer that is actually going to be applied to as it would in vivo. In vivo is harder to do, more expensive to do, but it's not the same. And unless you have a way to compare them, you don't know how inaccurate they might be. A lot of cell culture stuff is wildly inaccurate. And a lot of stuff, I mean, even in animal models, where you can control most things, they don't necessarily apply, they don't translate into clinical stuff. They don't you don't get the translational effects because people are different in terms of when they get the disease and all the stuff that you can't control that they're exposed to. And also you get clinical disease states in humans at a late stage usually, not at an early stage. Whereas in a cell culture model or in or organoid culture, you're controlling it from the beginning. So you can intervene on day one versus someone who's had, let's say, ALS for 2 years. Like, there's nothing you're going to do about the last 2 years. That train is gone.
Right.
You're now somewhere in the cascade of pathological cascades that you may not be able to do anything about at that stage.
Yeah. That's too bad.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be that way. It does not have to be that way. I mean, NIH has got a budget of, I can't remember how much they have. They have a budget of what, $80 billion, something ridiculous. Not ridiculous. I mean, something very high. But
do something with it.
do something that is going to be more scientifically valid and more in terms of actually driving health rather than going on blind assumptions, like safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective.
Right. Or spending, you think of autism, doing genetics research that's kept spinning over and over and finding different variants, maybe that have an impact, maybe 1% to 2% of it, and then finding 800 genes that are associated. And I know you've done some genetics research with, right? Looking at, I think you looked at de novo variants or CNVs, right?
One of the things that there was an interesting study that came out of a hospital in Toronto. That's called the Sick Children's Hospital. And they did a study, they were really going to nail down the genes they thought responsible for ASD. And they came back and said, well, okay, there's no genes per se. Might find one later, but we don't have a causal gene, but we're finding differences in DNA. But they're not the same differences. So you take 100 kids with ASD and you get 100 different little they're called SNPs, little bits of DNA, so-called non-coding DNA. And so I think one of the analogies one of the authors said, well, it's like all snowflakes make snowballs, but it's not the same snowflakes. Like different kinds of snow, and you can get different kinds of snowballs. So it's a little bit like that. You have multiple ways that you could interfere with normal functioning through these little things, but they're not genes. So the whole hunt for genes is a little like there was a time 20 years ago when a guy named Craig Ventner was pushing the Genome Project. And the idea was that every gene is going to be a disease. Okay, so if you understand all the genes that you've got, 23,000 or 22,000, whatever that number is correctly, that's 22,000 diseases you can solve. Well, that's not true.
Right.
It wasn't true then either. But that drove genetics research for a lot of neuroscience research for a long time.
Wow.
We were not looking at one of the genes that had been linked to one of the neurological diseases. You were not going to get funding.
Wow.
Yeah.
Meh.
Yeah.
Not good.
That was it. And they put all their eggs in that basket. These are gene diseases, which they are not. And the epidemiology, as slack as that field could be, basically made it pretty clear that only 5 to 10% of any of the major neurological diseases are gene deletions, mutations, or gain of function. That's it.
Well, what you looked at was de novo variants, so they weren't heritable, right? They're not coming.
No.
They're new variants. So are those because of toxins, or like how do those happen?
Don't know.
I don't know. Okay.
Don't know. I mean, those sections of DNA can change a lot. Different populations have different ones, and even within any population, depending on what they do, what they do in many cases may be, not a major disease driver. Some of them can be, and depending on different ones and where they are, and which chromosome they're on can make a bigger difference. But we don't know. Again, that's an area. The NIEHS out of Charlotte, North Carolina, basically had what was it called? Toxicogenomics group for a while back in the mid 2000s. And they were going to look at all those kinds of things. And then that whole group just faded away. And yet that's where the answer to these things lies. It is, you're looking at multiple factors.
That it's having on the genetics and
so
or epigenetics. What are we doing
precisely.
for our future genes and as they get passed on? And
And you see in almost every neurological disease talk I've seen in the last 20 years, they show this, Venn diagram. They show here's the genes, here's the toxins, and here's the age, and you put those all together and you get the disease. And yet we don't do that research. It's almost impossible to get that. And so again, if you want to understand these things, you have to look at the interaction of these factors. And you can make these kinds of things. You can make mice that have different knockouts of either genes or sections of DNA. And then you can give them the toxin that didn't change anything. Has that been done? Nope. I mean, a few things, but not much. That entity within NIEHS never took off. And so, and yet clearly that's where it's going to come down to. Because again, if only 5% or 10% are clear genetic mutations and 90% something else, well, it's not all the same molecule, it's the something else. So go,
do
acetaminophen plus gene deletions and gene and SNP differences.
Or the actual impact is.
Right. And or aluminum and or Tylenol or not hard to do.
Right. Well, and you bringing up Tylenol, I was going to ask too. So you had some studies on glutathione.
Yes.
And typically we all think of glutathione as our master antioxidant, but you had talked about it in relation to signal transduction. And so is there another role that most of us aren't aware of as far as it being involved in like the NMDA receptor, or what is that about?
Well, I mean, again, it is your major antioxidant. It is functional in the brain. And insofar as you're trying to prevent oxidative damage to various cells, and glutathione will do it. I mean, it's not as high in the brain as it is in other organs. But so yes, it will have a role. So if you're glutathione deficient, so for example, and the idea that acetaminophen might diminish it, glutathione. We don't know where does it diminish it. Does it diminish it everywhere? Does it diminish it in the brain? If insofar as it does, sure. Could that be a factor? Yes. I mean, but that story for me doesn't hold a lot of water because I don't think all the cases of ASD, and especially the severe forms, is like the mom was popping pills during their pregnancy for 9 months. I don't think so.
Right. But in the combination with vaccines, if you deplete it and then you have a toxin.
Sure. And
That's
no, exactly. And so that, I mean, it's like, one loads the gun, one pulls the trigger kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, are there, and again, that's why the toxicogenomics studies should have been more done, because that's the exact sort of thing. You have these various factors working together, or, even the polytoxin idea. You've got two toxins, they're both bad, and where you have one bad toxin and one bad toxin, it's not two. Yeah, the cumulative score is not 2, it's 102, because they facilitate each other. And so they're both doing different things. Aluminum, it has impacts throughout your nervous system. Maybe acetaminophen does too. And you put the two together and you have a cumulative weight of damage that's far more than either one alone. Maybe.
Yeah, and you have to do those studies. Yeah.
Yeah, but most of the studies targeting acetaminophen were basically, again, meta-analyses. Very little bench science that I can see. I mean, yeah, you could do that. I mean, that's not impossible to do. But again, in a bench science study, you could look at exactly those kind of things. Which is the trigger, which is the gun. Those kinds of things could take you a long way to understand. Because are you going to ban? I mean, you're going to ban all Tylenol? No,
I mean, I think the whole point with that is that we're not talking about the risks. It's become where the conversations are just, it's safe, take it if you're, haven't had any minor pains and aches. And as a pharmacist, I can say that has been kind of a narrative, whereas that shouldn't be, when there's always a risk with any medication in pregnancy. It should always be lowest effective dose. And so that's where I felt like that was needed to happen, is just get back to cautionary and not just taking it willy-nilly, like it's no big deal, and actually realizing there are risks besides just hepatotoxicity alone. And then that the level in the fetus is similar to the mom's blood, and we're giving mom full adult doses, so that was a big problem. And we don't understand fetal development or fetal enzyme development. Like there's so many factors that I feel like it needed to happen, because we just need to get back to safety and talking about that all these medications have a risk.
Well, they all do. And again, this comes back, I mean, again, because you're right, it comes back to the precautionary principle. And if you don't want to fund those studies that would answer those questions, then you're going to just go on assumptions.
Yep.
And which is what I mean, that's where the CDC and the FDA have failed massively over the years, is they just don't do those kind of things anymore. They don't do their own stuff, as you know, right?
Right.
They just don't. So, what they're basically doing is they're counting on scientists at various academic institutions doing it, but then they don't fund it.
Yeah.
So how are you going to do it? You go to the Salvation Army and ask for money, and what are you going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. Has to get to the right place and right people.
Yeah, and so again, most of the evaluations of both those two entities is looking at the pharmaceutical company data and going, oh, it looks okay to me.
Right, which is completely biased. I mean,
well, especially when you're getting paid by those same companies. Yes. So, for every, with the FDA, every drug they approve, they get more money from the pharma. So what is it? Something like, I think Kennedy has talked about it, something like 40% of their budget is built on pharma.
Oh my gosh.
I know. So what do you think you're going to get? And the conflicts of interest in both of those entities, including the NIH, is huge. Absolutely gigantic.
There should be no involvement between pharma and government. It shouldn't exist, but it's very clear that it does.
Oh, it does. And so, the people who have it, I mean, again, on day one, Kennedy, I don't know if he, what extent he did this. You should basically say, okay, we're all going to fill out conflict of interest guidelines. And here's what's going to happen from now on. You may have no pharma relationship whatsoever. And after you leave here, 5-year period before which you can go to work for them, and a 5-year period or 10-year period before when you didn't work for them. And don't talk to the drug reps. Sorry, those Those are not your, you go, go do your own stuff.
Yep.
And until you do that, until you get, all the people who have just blatant conflicts of interest out of it. Yeah, it's like the Upton St. Clair thing, it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. And they're never going to come to the conclusion when, when the private school for their kids and their Porsche is on the line. You think they're gonna come up with the right answer?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, hopefully we're on the right track there.
That's hope.
Yeah.
That's hope.
Yeah. No, I just getting back to glutathione. Is there anything? Does that have another role though besides being an antioxidant? Like, does it directly work on the receptor?
I think it does.
On the NMDA receptor?
I think it could do. It could modify. And there's lots of modification sites for the NMDA receptor, so it could modify how well the receptor works. But it seems it has its own receptors. There are glutathione receptors, and they do actually depolarize cells. At least our work showed it. We never were able to pursue that, but definitely it is a neurotransmitter. Well, in my view, in the brain, and so in a lot of receptors interact at the cellular membrane, or even internally, and they basically the modification of one modifies the other. And so if you have glutathione receptors, which cause depolarization of cells, next to NMDA receptors that cause depolarization of cells, they can in fact, have so-called modification sites that are very close to both of those receptors. So for example, where benzodiazepines work is on a kind of GABA receptor, inhibitory neurotransmitter, but it's not directly on the GABA receptor site, it's next to it. So that's how it modifies that. And if glutathione was examined in more detail, which receptors it interacts with, I think you quite a lot. So I'm
just so curious because it's in a lot of these kids, it seems to be a GABA glutamate imbalance where there's more glutamate and less GABA, and or something with the NMDA receptor, and so that's why I just curious. That's just intriguing to me because any way that you can decrease excitation or that NMDA receptor activation, whether that be magnesium or glutathione or through NAC, whichever that is, it's just interesting that could be a potential eventually to look at.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it should be looked at. And again, I don't know anyone doing it. Maybe there are.
Right.
We did a lot of glutathione work in the late 90s, and it's fascinating stuff. And it's a fascinating molecule. It's one of the certainly one of the earliest antioxidants, and it is your dominant antioxidant system, and it declines with age. So you might expect it to do less free radical chelation than it would do kind of in middle age. Also has a developmental curve, so little kids have less of it than 20-year-olds, and 20-year-olds have more of it than 80-year-olds, and so at both ends of the age spectrum, the antioxidant defenses are going to play a role. I mean, one of the things you see with all the neurological diseases at the time of death for many of these diseases, that's where we know most of it because you get post-mortem material. You have a number of things going on. One of them is you have changes in mitochondrial activity. You have changes in antioxidant enzymes, and so you have more oxidant stress. And what's the third thing? I know it was microbiome. So tying it back to other health stuff, your microbiome is affected in all these cases. So if I ever caught one of those diseases, if I ever came down with one of those diseases, I would do those three things. I would get my inflammatory marker under control. I would get my mitochondrial.
What would you use? Would you use what antioxidants or phytochemicals would you use?
I would use, for example, I just for mitochondria, something like Q10. And I would make sure my catalase, superoxide dismutase, and glutathione levels were high. I would definitely go regulate my microbiome and see what was going on there. And I would generally try and control inflammation by various means. Those were the things I would do. One of them.
What about prebiotic for supporting gut epithelial barrier, like an insulin or something to.
Absolutely, all those things. And the other thing I would do is, I'm starting to look at hyperbaric oxygen in terms of neurological disease. I'd be putting myself in there every
Just what's
week.
the benefit of hyperbaric oxygen, or how does that work?
Well, hyperbaric oxygen puts more oxygen onto your cells and supports more more of the electron transport chain in mitochondria. So what it's basically
Supporting
doing is
mitochondria dysfunction.
and it's
Okay.
putting more creating more ATP, which is supporting more neural activity. Okay, which is one of the things that does decrease in various neurological diseases. So I would definitely work on that. And
What about red light therapy? Is there any evidence for that supporting?
I don't know about it. I know
Okay.
anecdotally a lot of people believe it
Yeah.
does. And again, I've been looking at hyperbaric because there's a concept called the idling neuron concept. Okay, so the idling neuron basically means that, again, we talked about dead and very dead, right? So some cells just may not, especially neural cells, may not be happy because they are not getting enough oxygen, they're not getting enough nutrients, they're not getting enough, et cetera. And therefore, they're not functioning well, but they're not gone. And the idea is if you can increase your partial pressure of oxygen through hyperbaric, because most of the oxygen in your blood is bound to hemoglobin. But if you can put more into the blood itself, into the plasma, you're going to get more oxygen into your cells. Okay, and so yeah, do you have to worry about free radical damage? Yeah, you do, but the same thing happens with when you're doing exercise. Same thing happens under any number of circumstances. So there are ways around that, and so a lot of the hyperbaric treatments actually give glutathione as
Well, I
a
just
adjuvant.
say if you would give like NAC or glutathione while you
Yeah,
did it.
and so yeah, well, you do it, and so yes, you may be, but also the hyperbaric oxygen through that process, putting more oxygen in the blood, also turns on genes that make other antioxidants. So
Okay.
make proteins that also serve. So you're basically when people say, well, hyperbaric oxygen is going to increase free radicals, and free radicals are damaging. That's true, but again, the very process itself basically creates more antioxidants.
Interesting. I think I
Yeah.
expect to see it there, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on, and it's been fun talking to you.